Imagine paying $30 million for a single water-stained notebook, or hiding in a broom closet to steal a painting and accidentally triggering a global media circus, cementing it as the most famous image in human history. Today, we are unrolling the blueprints of the ultimate genius, stripping away centuries of myth-making to look solely at the man himself. We will uncover how an insatiable, almost obsessive curiosity can entirely rewire how you see the world around you. Because when you look at the sheer volume of his life's work, it is immediately clear that Leonardo da Vinci was not just a painter, nor was he just an engineer. He was a polymath, in the truest sense of the word. Welcome to Legendary Lives Unveiled. If you are fascinated by the hidden truths behind history's greatest minds, make sure to subscribe and like this video to join us on this journey into the past. To truly understand the mechanics behind his genius, we must start at his surprisingly humble beginnings, shattering the first major myth. We must discard the image of Renaissance masters as privileged scholars walking the halls of grand academies. We journey back to the year 1452, specifically Saturday, April 15th, at about 10:30 at night, to a little Tuscan hill town called Vinci, located about 20 miles outside of Florence. Leonardo is born into a very specific and highly disadvantaged social situation. He is the illegitimate son of Ser Piero, a wealthy, successful Florentine legal notary, and a woman named Caterina. Caterina's background is a fascinating historical puzzle, traditionally described as a lower-class peasant girl, a tavern servant, or an orphaned farmhand. Yet, recent historical hypotheses, based on uncovered tax and legal documents, suggest she might have actually been a slave, possibly brought to Italy from the Middle East or the Mediterranean region. Regardless of her exact origins, the central defining fact of Leonardo's early life is that his parents were not married. In 15th century Italy, this illegitimacy carried massive, life-altering legal weight. Because his parents were unwed, Leonardo had no surname in the modern sense. Da Vinci literally just means of Vinci. More devastatingly, his illegitimate status completely barred him from inheriting his father's prestigious profession. The Guild of Notaries was a powerful, highly regulated professional association in Florence that strictly refused to accept illegitimate children. He was effectively locked out of the traditional, respectable career paths that a young man of his father's standing would naturally pursue. He was entirely shut out of the elite academic and professional world before he even had a chance to begin. Because he couldn't be a notary, he was not groomed for the university, leaving him without a formal classical education. He couldn't read Latin, and initially, he even struggled with mathematics. This was a monumental barrier, as the academic world of the Renaissance was entirely reliant on ancient texts, with Latin acting as the gatekeeper to all human knowledge. If you wanted to study medicine, you didn't observe a body. You read the Roman physician Galen and took his word for it. To understand physics or the natural world, you read Aristotle, never questioning the texts, merely memorizing the Latin. But Leonardo couldn't read those books. Unable to read the manual, he had to take the machine apart himself. He later referred to himself, almost with a chip on his shoulder, as a disciple of experience. If he wanted to know how water flowed, or how a bird stayed in the air, he had to look at it with his own two eyes. This lack of formal education forced him to develop a radically empirical mindset, bypassing the dogma of the ancients to go straight to the source, nature itself. He became the ultimate observer, a pursuit actively encouraged by his family. His uncle Francesco and his grandfather Antonio sent him out into the fields and vineyards around their home to study the world. He spent hours observing lizards, dissecting plants, watching glowworms, and tracking wild animals. There is a famous note from later in his life, where he recorded what he claimed was his very first childhood memory. He wrote that while lying in his cradle, a kite, a large bird of prey common in Tuscany, flew down and opened his mouth with its tail feathers, striking him against the lips. While likely a dream or a psychological fantasy projected backward, it perfectly encapsulates his lifelong obsession with flight and the mechanics of nature. That unstructured time in the Tuscan hills trained his eye to view the world not as a static backdrop, but as a dynamic, interconnected system of forces, growth, and continuous movement. He constantly sketched these subjects, eventually prompting his father to recognize his undeniable talent. Around the mid-1460s, Ser Piero moved the 14-year-old Leonardo to the Silicon Valley of the 15th century, Florence. Ruled by the powerful Medici family, Florence was the epicenter of banking, culture, and artistic innovation. Leonardo was apprenticed to Andrea del Verrocchio, whose workshop, or bottega, was one of the most prestigious and commercially successful in the city. This was no quiet, solitary studio. It was an intensely collaborative, chaotic, loud, and highly technical environment. A Renaissance manufacturing plant crossed with a laboratory. Apprentices learned the chemistry required to mix pigments from raw minerals, alongside metallurgy and plaster casting, as Verrocchio was primarily a sculptor. They practiced leatherworking, mechanics, woodwork, and grinding stones, building a foundation in heavy engineering just to create art. The cross-pollination of trades in that room shaped Leonardo's entire multidisciplinary approach as he worked shoulder to shoulder with future masters like Botticelli and Perugino. In this demanding environment, Verrocchio received a major church commission to paint the baptism of Christ. Standard procedure dictated the master designed the composition and painted the main figures, Jesus and John the Baptist, while apprentices filled in the background scenery, or minor characters. Leonardo was assigned a small section on the far left to paint a single angel holding some garments. Here, his technical innovation exploded, fundamentally changing the chemistry of the assignment. Verrocchio painted primarily in tempera, pigment powder mixed with egg yolk, which dries almost instantly. This prevented blending. Shadows required tiny overlapping lines called hatching, leaving a flat, opaque, sharp-edged finish. Leonardo, however, experimented with oil paint, a new medium from Northern Europe, mixed with linseed or walnut oil. Oil dries incredibly slowly, taking days or weeks, allowing Leonardo to apply translucent layers or glazes. He pushed the wet paint around on the panel, blurring edges and mixing shadows directly into the light areas to create a soft, luminous, incredibly lifelike figure with glowing skin and cascading hair. It contrasted completely with Verrocchio's stiffer, traditional temper figures next to it, looking like a high-definition photograph pasted next to a cartoon. Legend dictates Verrocchio saw the angel, realized a child had vastly surpassed him, and vowed never to paint again, though likely a romanticized myth. Delegating tedious painting contracts to a prodigy simply made perfect economic sense for a sculptor focusing on lucrative bronze commissions. The startling, visceral realism of Leonardo's talent was undeniable. His deep scientific observations continued to fuel his art, perfectly illustrated by the Medusa shield. A local peasant asked Ser Piero to have a simple wooden buckler shield painted with a standard decoration. Handed the task, Leonardo decided to paint a terrifying, fire-spitting Medusa monster. He captured real lizards, bats, maggots, and toads, bringing them into his bedroom to study their actual anatomy, how a bat's wing folds or the scales on a lizard's snout. His room smelled terribly of decaying animal parts, but he combined these observations into a hyper-realistic, biologically plausible beast. He understood that true horror required anatomical functionality. The painting was so terrifyingly lifelike that Ser Piero flinched backward in genuine horror upon seeing it. Realizing its value, Ser Piero secretly bought a cheap replacement for the peasant and sold Leonardo's monster shield to a Florentine art dealer for a massive sum of 100 ducats, before it eventually ended up in the collection of the Duke of Milan. But his time in Florence was not solely defined by artistic triumphs. In a sharp reminder of the strict, dangerous social codes of the era, the 24-year-old Leonardo and 3 other young men were anonymously accused of sodomy in 1476, involving a well-known male prostitute named Jacopo Soltarelli. The night officers, essentially the vice squad of Florence, took these charges extremely seriously. Punishments could include public humiliation, exile, or even burning at the stake. It was a genuinely terrifying ordeal. The charges were dropped after 2 hearings due to a stated lack of corroborating witnesses. But historical consensus strongly suggests the powerful Medici family used their influence to protect one of the accused, Leonardo da Tornabuoni, a close relative of Lorenzo de' Medici. This brush with deadly peril gives us a rare glimpse into the shadows of a man who was otherwise intensely, almost pathologically, private, hiding behind his art. But the restless genius was about to seek out a far darker, more violent stage. The brush with deadly peril gives us a rare glimpse into the shadows of a man who was otherwise intensely, almost pathologically, private. Across his 13,000 pages of surviving notebooks, he discusses the cosmos, the flow of water, and the anatomy of the heart. Yet he rarely, if ever, mentions his own personal feelings, his fears, or his intimate relationships. It was all just data to him. However, looking at the entirety of his life, historians generally agree that he was homosexual. There is absolutely no record of him ever having a romantic or sexual relationship with a woman. Instead, he formed lifelong, deeply close companionships with his male assistants and pupils. Most notably, a young boy who entered his household later on at age 10, whom Leonardo nicknamed Salai, which translates to the little devil. Back in Florence, despite his undeniable talent, the young master was cultivating an infamous reputation for leaving commissions unfinished. He would secure a major contract, such as the Adoration of the Magi for the monks of San Donato. He would dive into the incredibly complex preliminary sketches, becoming absolutely fascinated by the underlying geometry of the composition and the intellectual problem of the perspective. Yet, the moment his brain had solved the puzzle, the actual physical labor of finishing the painting bored him, and he would simply lose interest, incredibly frustrating the patrons paying him. By the year 1482, at 30 years old, Leonardo was restless. Florence, the city of thinkers, bankers, and philosophers, was highly competitive, and the Medici were starting to favor other artists like Botticelli. Feeling stifled, Leonardo looked north to a bigger, more chaotic, and more lucrative stage, Milan. Milan was a military powerhouse, constantly threatened by French invasions from the north and rival city-states from the south. Ruled by the incredibly powerful and quite ruthless Duke Ludovico Sforza. It was a gritty, pragmatic place where an ambitious man could make a massive fortune, not just decorating chapels, but in the business of war, seeking employment. Leonardo drafted what is essentially a cold-pitch resume, one of the most fascinating documents in history. He did not pitch himself as the artist who painted a luminous angel. Instead, he marketed himself as a heavy military weapons contractor. The staggering letter contained 10 bullet points. The first 9 were entirely and exclusively about military engineering, weapons, and defense. He promised portable bridges indestructible by fire, methods to drain water from enemy moats, safe and unassailable armored vehicles, secret underground tunnels dug without any noise, and cannons that fired a hailstorm of stones to terrify the enemy with smoke and destruction. It is only at the very end, in the 10th point, almost as an afterthought, that he added he could give perfect satisfaction in architecture during times of peace, carry out sculpture in marble, bronze, or clay, and do in painting whatever may be done. This document reveals a profound, almost jarring paradox in his personality. The man sketching out these horrific flesh-tearing machines of death, including a literal wooden tank shaped like a turtle shell, covered in cannons designed to crush infantry, was the exact same man who was a strict, highly vocal vegetarian. He was so opposed to animal suffering that he preferred to wear linen instead of leather, refusing to wear the skin of dead animals. Contemporary accounts describe him walking through the bustling markets of Florence and Milan, seeing vendors selling little songbirds in bamboo cages. He would use his own money to buy the cages, open the doors, and immediately set the birds free into the sky. His deep anatomical studies and intense observation of nature led him to the sincere belief that animals felt pain, experienced fear, and possessed a natural right to liberty. He even referred to the eating of meat as making one's body a tomb for other animals. How does the man who weeps over a caged finch pitch a giant mechanical scythe to chop off soldiers' legs? It came down to the brutal economic reality of Renaissance patronage. Leonardo was a deeply empathetic, pacifist observer of nature at heart, but to fund his insatiable scientific curiosity, to buy the extremely expensive paper for his thousands of notebook pages, to secure raw materials for experiments, and to have the time to dissect bodies, he had to appeal to the power structures of his era. Warlords like Ludovico Sforza held the purse strings. He recognized that in a militarized society, engineering weapons was his most lucrative skill. He used his genius to design tools of war, fundamentally conflicting with his personal morality, because it bought him the freedom to pursue his science. Sforza hired him for massive, tangible projects, the grandest being the Gran Cavallo. This was a commission to build a 66-ton bronze equestrian statue of Sforza's father, designed to be the largest horse statue in the history of the world. Leonardo spent years studying the anatomy of horses and figuring out the incredibly complex thermodynamics of casting that much molten bronze in a single pour without cracking. He built a massive 24-foot tall clay model in a courtyard that drew travelers from all over Europe just to marvel at it. It was poised to be the defining engineering and artistic triumph of the 15th century. But the geopolitical reality of Milan crashed down on him. In 1494, the French army invaded Italy. Needing artillery, Duke Sforza confiscated all 66 tons of Leonardo's carefully stockpiled bronze and melted it down to cast cannons to defend the city walls. When the French soldiers eventually captured Milan, they used Leonardo's beautiful 24-foot clay model for crossbow target practice, shooting it to pieces until it collapsed into the mud. Over a decade of his life, poured into solving the engineering problems of that statue, was destroyed for nothing. It perfectly encapsulates the tragedy of his ambition. His mind was always colliding with the violent, unstable political reality of his time. Ironically, during this Milan period, he created one of his most enduring and mechanically problematic masterpieces, The Last Supper. Commissioned by Sforza to paint the wall of the refectory, the dining hall of the Santa Maria delle Grazie convent, the artwork is an absolute masterpiece of dramatic narrative. Instead of a static meal, Leonardo captures the exact explosive millisecond after Jesus says, "One of you will betray me." Grouping the apostles into dynamic clusters of 3, he created incredible psychological tension where shock, anger, and denial rippled down the table. Yet, mechanically and technically, the painting was an absolute disaster, born of his categorical refusal to accept the proven way of doing things. The traditional method for murals was buon fresco, or true fresco, where the artist applies a layer of wet plaster to the wall and immediately paints onto it with water-based pigments. As the plaster dries and cures, a chemical reaction locks the pigment molecules inside the crystal structure of the wall itself, making it incredibly durable. But because it dries quickly, the artist must work very fast in small patches, unable to make changes without chipping the plaster off to start over. Leonardo, a slow, deliberate thinker, hated this. He wanted to use his beloved oil paints, work slowly, apply translucent layers, and revise the subtle shading around Judas's eyes weeks later. So, he invented an experimental technique, coating the stone wall with a base layer of lead white, gesso, and mastic, and painting over it using oil and tempera on a dry wall. He tragically failed to account for the environmental mechanics of the room. The refectory was an exterior wall backing onto a damp kitchen environment, with moisture constantly seeping through the porous stone. Because the paint wasn't chemically bonded to the plaster like a true fresco, the moisture simply pushed the paint right off the wall. Within 20 years, while Leonardo was still alive to see it, the painting literally started blistering, flaking, and crumbling onto the floor. Over the centuries, it suffered terrible, heavy-handed restorations, French troops throwing stones at the apostles' faces during the Napoleonic Wars, and an Allied bomb in World War II that destroyed the roof and a wall of the dining hall. Those sandbags miraculously saved the painting. Today, we see a ghostly fraction of his original brushwork, yet its underlying geometry and sheer psychological depth remain so powerful that it is the most reproduced religious painting in human history. During this time, his household expanded to include the aforementioned Salai, a 10-year-old working-class boy taken in as an apprentice and servant. By all accounts, Salai was an absolute nightmare. Leonardo's own ledger detailed Salai's crimes, explicitly calling him a thief, a liar, obstinate, and a glutton. Salai stole money out of Leonardo's coat pockets, stole valuable silver from clients, broke things, and spent an absolute fortune on luxurious clothes and shoes. Yet, profoundly revealing Leonardo's paternal blindness, he indulged the boy completely, forgiving him every single time. He bought him expensive capes and kept him in his household for 30 years, to the very end of his life, displaying a soft human side to an intellect that seemed otherwise cold and superhuman. But to truly understand that superhuman intellect, we must open the private vault of his mind, his notebooks. Throughout his life, Leonardo was a relentless, obsessive notekeeper, wearing a leather belt from which hung a small notebook and a vial of ink. Whether he saw a person with a strange nose, a water eddy, or a bird taking flight, he sketched it immediately, producing an estimated 20,000 pages, of which about 7,000 survive today. At first glance, his handwriting looks like an alien code. Written in mirror script, the letters are backward, flowing from the right side of the page to the left. For centuries, Victorian historians romanticized this as a secret cipher, deliberately designed to hide heretical scientific discoveries from the Inquisition or protect engineering patents. The reality is far more pragmatic. He was simply left-handed. Writing with a sharpened goose quill and wet ink, a left-handed person writing left to right would drag their hand across freshly written words, constantly smearing them into a ruined blur. By reversing direction, he kept his hand ahead of the wet ink, an ergonomic solution readable by anyone with a hand mirror. Inside, the notebooks are a staggering, chaotic stream of consciousness. A grocery list to buy bread and wine sits next to a complex geometric proof, adjacent to a design for inflatable shoes meant for walking on water. But it is the hard science that makes these pages genuinely historically significant. So valuable that in 1994, Bill Gates purchased the Codex Leicester, focusing primarily on water flow, geology, and the moon's luminosity, for over $30 million. Yet, the true horror and brilliance of his observations lay deeper beneath the skin, waiting in the freezing, flickering darkness, where he peeled back the very layers of human mortality. His anatomical studies began in his 20s simply as a tool to improve his art, specifically to understand the musculature beneath the skin so he could paint more realistic, dynamic figures. But very quickly, the art became secondary, as the science became an all-consuming obsession in its own right. Over his lifetime, Leonardo dissected over 30 human corpses. This was dirty, highly dangerous, and incredibly grim work. In an era long before refrigeration, formaldehyde, or chemical preservatives, he literally worked by the light of a flickering candle in the freezing basements of hospitals like Santa Maria Nuova, standing over decomposing bodies. He had to deal with the overwhelming stench of decay and the very real risk of deadly infection if he merely nicked his finger with his scalpel. He worked incredibly fast, peeling back skin and fascia, trying to sketch the structures before the tissue literally liquefied. The physical tools and techniques he invented to understand the body are incredible. He wanted to understand the three-dimensional shape of the brain ventricles, the empty cavities inside the brain. However, if you slice a brain open, the cavities just collapse into mush, meaning you cannot see the shape of empty space. To circumvent this, he took hot, melted beeswax, and using a syringe he designed himself, he injected the liquid wax directly into the base of the brain of a cadaver. When the wax cooled and solidified inside the brain, it formed a perfect, rigid cast of the internal cavities. He could then take his scalpel, dissect the soft brain tissue away, and be left holding a perfect 3D wax model of the internal structure. It was the first known use of a solidifying medium in anatomical history, a conceptual technique modern neurologists use almost exactly today with plastics. He also tackled the heart, seeking to understand how the aortic valve opens and closes to pump blood. He literally took a real bull's heart, made a mold of the aorta, and blew a glass model of it. Because water is clear and the currents cannot be seen, he pumped water mixed with buoyant grass seeds through this glass tube to make the invisible flow patterns visible. What he observed by watching those seeds swirl in the glass was revolutionary. He saw that the water rushing up through the valve created a swirling vortex behind the valve flaps. He deduced that it is actually this swirling vortex, not the pressure from below, that pushes the valve flaps closed after the blood passes through. He was mapping systolic blood flow vortices in the 1500s, an insight so profound that modern cardiology didn't fully prove that specific vortex dynamic correct until the year 2014, using MRI technology. It took us 500 years to catch up to what Leonardo figured out with a glass tube and some grass seeds. Furthermore, he accurately mapped the entire human dental structure, all 32 teeth, including the roots, their function, and how they relate to the jawbone, making him arguably the first pioneer of modern dentistry. Yet, this brings up the most tragic aspect of his life's work. If he was mapping blood flow vortices centuries ahead of his time, why didn't he publish any of it? It was overwhelmingly a combination of his famous perfectionism and being easily distracted. He fully intended to publish treatises on anatomy, painting, and water. leaving notes to himself about organizing them. But his notebooks were fundamentally chaotic. A single page might contain a sketch of a fetus in the womb, a geometric theorem about squaring the circle, and a recipe for making blonde hair dye. To organize that massive tangled web into a coherent manuscript required a linear administrative focus that Leonardo simply did not possess. His curiosity was too voracious. The moment he saw the grass seeds swirl and understood the heart valve, the mystery was solved, and the intellectual itch was scratched. The actual administrative labor of explaining it to other people bored him, so he moved on to the next mystery. Because he didn't publish, his discoveries did absolutely nothing to advance human science at the time. Decades later, Andreas Vesalius published his anatomical drawings and rightfully gets the credit as the father of modern anatomy, while Leonardo's vastly superior, more accurate drawings sat gathering dust in a wooden trunk in an attic. It wasn't just bodies in those trunks. He was utterly obsessed with the mechanics of the air. His Codex on the Flight of Birds is one of the most important foundational documents in aeronautical history. He realized early on that birds don't just float in the air like boats on water. He understood that air was a fluid with density and resistance. Dissecting bird wings, he studied their complex musculature and how the feathers overlap to catch the air on the downstroke and open on the upstroke, applying those biological principles to human engineering. He designed an aerial screw, a massive spiral made of linen stretched over wire, which is essentially the 15th century precursor to the helicopter. Understanding the physics of friction, he knew that if men were turning a heavy wooden crank to spin this rotor, the base would grind against the platform and catch fire or seize up. To solve this, he designed an early version of ball bearings, little metal spheres placed between rotating parts to smooth the rotation and reduce friction. He also designed a parachute, a large, rigid, wooden pyramid covered in sealed linen. For centuries, engineers looked at his sketch and thought it was a joke, calculating that the heavy wooden frame would crush the person when they landed and wouldn't create enough drag. But they were wrong. In the year 2000, a British skydiver named Adrian Nicholas tested it, building Leonardo's exact design using only materials available in the 15th century: canvas, wood, and rope. He hauled this massive pyramid up in a hot air balloon to 10,000 feet and jumped out. It deployed, it caught the air, and Nicholas drifted down safely, noting the ride was significantly smoother and had less swaying than modern parachutes. It was a stunning validation. He was designing functional, aerodynamically sound deceleration devices 3 full centuries before the first hot air balloon flight was ever achieved. While his incredible notebooks remained hidden, the political winds shifted in 1499 when the French army captured Milan, overthrowing Sforza and forcing Leonardo to flee. By the 1500s, he returned to Florence as a famous but aging master around 50 years old. Florence had overthrown the Medici and was now a republic, and Leonardo took a job working as the chief military engineer for Cesare Borgia, the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, and arguably the most ruthless, terrifying warlord in Italy. Borgia is famously the primary inspiration for Niccolò Machiavelli's definitive book on political power, The Prince. Traveling across central Italy with Borgia's army, inspecting fortresses and drawing maps, Leonardo met Machiavelli himself, who was traveling as a diplomat. The two absolute legends of the Renaissance struck up a friendship and collaborated on a massive, almost absurdly audacious engineering plot. Florence was at war with Pisa, whose strength relied entirely on the Arno River flowing through it to the sea. Machiavelli and Leonardo hatched a plan to literally steal the river by digging a massive system of canals to divert the entire Arno River away from Pisa, cutting off their freshwater supply and access to the sea to end the war without a siege. Leonardo calculated the water pressure and the gradient of the land, determining it would take exactly 54,000 man-days of labor to dig the trench. The Florentine government approved it and started digging, but they cheaped out, ignoring Leonardo's exact specifications for the depth of the canal. The river flooded the wrong way, the trenches collapsed, and the project was a total humiliating failure. However, his time with Borgia wasn't a total loss, as he created a map of the town of Imola that revolutionized cartography. At the time, maps were merely symbolic drawings from a hillside, showing pictures of hills, an oversized main church, and squiggly lines for roads. Leonardo used specialized geometric surveying tools, like an astrolabe and an odometer he designed, to measure the exact distances and angles of every street mathematically. He created an impossibly accurate, top-down, satellite-style map of the city centuries before anyone had ever been in a balloon, so perfect you can literally still use it to navigate the streets of Imola today. His return to Florence also put him on a direct, intense, and highly public collision course with the new rising star of the Renaissance, Michelangelo, a young, fiery, notoriously grumpy sculptor in his 20s. They were opposites. Leonardo was elegant, wore pink tunics, loved music, and was aging. The Florentine government, wanting a showdown, commissioned both of them to paint massive battle scenes on opposite walls in the exact same room. The Hall of the 500 in the Palazzo Vecchio, Leonardo was assigned to paint the Battle of Anghiari, a violent, twisting scene of horses and warriors screaming in the mud. True to form, despite the disaster of the Last Supper, Leonardo once again refused to use standard fresco techniques, inventing a new experimental method involving mixing thick oil paints with wax. But the room was cold, and the waxy paint wasn't drying fast enough. To speed up the curing process, he set up massive braziers, large iron baskets full of burning coal, at the base of the wall to bake the paint onto the stone. He miscalculated the thermodynamics. Heat rises, but it diffuses. The heat baked the bottom perfectly, but couldn't reach the upper parts of the massive wall in sufficient concentration. The wax in the upper layers got warm, but not hot enough to cure. Instead, it just melted. The thick, beautiful paint literally began to liquefy and drip down the wall, bleeding into a muddy mess and ruining the masterpiece before it was even finished. He was so frustrated that he abandoned the project entirely in a highly public failure. Yet, it is precisely around the same time in 1503 that Leonardo accepted a relatively modest commission from a local Florentine silk merchant named Francesco del Giocondo to paint a portrait of his wife, Lisa Gherardini. This became the Mona Lisa. Artistically, the Mona Lisa is the absolute culmination of everything Leonardo had learned across his entire life, applying all his observations about science, anatomy, geology, and optics to a single piece of poplar wood. It is the ultimate demonstration of his sfumato technique, translating from Italian as vanished or evaporated like smoke. There are no hard outlines or borders anywhere on her face. Modern X-ray and chemical analysis shows that he applied up to 35 microscopic layers of extremely diluted oil paint, layers thinner than a human hair. He spent years slowly building up the shadows around her eyes and the corners of her mouth using these nearly invisible glazes. Like a perfect crossfade in modern audio mixing, he lowered the light and raised the shadow so incredibly slowly over so many microscopic layers that your eye cannot physically detect the transition point. This optical trick is exactly why her smile is so famously elusive, as the shadows around her mouth mimic the way human peripheral vision works. If you look directly at her eyes, your peripheral vision picks up the soft shadows around her mouth, registering it as a smile. But when you look directly at her mouth, your foveal vision, your sharp central focus, can't find a hard line, flattening out the expression so the smile seems to shift and disappear. He engineered an interactive painting using the biology of the human retina. This technique perfectly represents his philosophical worldview. Everything is connected. Through dissecting muscles and watching water currents, he realized nothing in nature actually has a hard, distinct line. Light bleeds endlessly into shadow. Water flows continuously into water, and muscles glide seamlessly beneath the skin. It is a masterclass in the fluid, continuous, and deeply interconnected nature of reality. But its status as a global, inescapable superstar is actually a product of the 20th century media. For centuries, it was just a highly respected, slightly dark portrait sitting quietly on a wall in the Louvre. In 1911, an Italian handyman named Vincenzo Peruggia, who had briefly worked at the Louvre helping build protective glass cases, hid inside a broom closet overnight. In the morning, he walked out, took the painting off the wall, removed its frame, hid the panel under his smock, and simply walked out the front door. In the era of exploding mass-market daily newspapers, the theft created an unprecedented international media circus. For 2 entire years, her face was printed on the front page almost every single day. The desperate French police even arrested a young, innocent Pablo Picasso, questioning him while he wept on the stand. The true crime media frenzy birthed modern viral culture, with people flocking to the Louvre waiting in line just to stare at the empty hook. Peruggia was eventually caught 2 years later trying to sell the painting to an art dealer in Florence, claiming he was patriotically returning the artwork to Italy. By the time she was returned to Paris on a special train, she was the most famous woman in the world. Interestingly, Leonardo never actually gave the painting to Francesco del Giocondo. He kept that piece of wood with him for the rest of his life, constantly tweaking those microscopic layers. By 1513, Leonardo was in his 60s, housed in the Vatican under Pope Leo X. But times had changed. Younger men like Michelangelo and Raphael were getting the massive, prestigious commissions. Given a minor painting job by the Pope, Leonardo instead immediately started experimenting with distilling a brand new chemical varnish from herbs. The exasperated Pope canceled the commission, supposedly saying, "This man will never accomplish anything. He thinks of the end before the beginning." Sidelined and disillusioned, Leonardo spent his time in Rome doing anatomical dissections, studying geometry, and hilariously playing elaborate pranks. He found a bizarre-looking lizard in the Vatican gardens, made fake wings out of other lizard scales, attached a little horn to its head, dipped the wings in quicksilver so they quivered and flashed, and kept it in a box to terrify visiting friends. He was an aging, unparalleled genius, feeling ignored by the world, playing with a glittering lizard in his bedroom. A final lifeline appeared in 1516 from the north. The new, wealthy 21-year-old king of France, Francis I, absolutely idolized the Italian Renaissance and invited the 64-year-old Leonardo to move to France, giving him the grand title First Painter, Engineer, and Architect to the king, a generous lifetime pension, and the beautiful brick manor Château du Clos-Lucé. Francis treated him more like a revered philosopher and a father figure. Leonardo crossed the treacherous Alps on a mule, bringing his young aristocratic assistant, Francesco Melzi, his 13,000 pages of chaotic notebooks, and 3 paintings he just couldn't part with, including the Mona Lisa. Francis didn't demand a quota of paintings. He just wanted to walk over, sit by the fire, and talk with him to absorb his wisdom. Leonardo did provide the conceptual design for the famous central staircase at the massive Château de Chambord, a pure, uncut double helix design where two separate spiral staircases wrap around a hollow central column. People could walk up and down simultaneously, seeing each other through interior windows, but their paths would never cross. Around age 65, he suffered a stroke that left his right hand paralyzed. Naturally left-handed, he could still sketch and write in his notebooks, but his ability to paint fine details was effectively over. A profound, heavy sense of melancholy permeated his final notebook entries as he looked back over his abandoned bronze horses and melting walls, writing, "While I thought that I was learning how to live, I have been learning how to die." He genuinely felt he had offended God and mankind by not working at his art as he should have. Yet, the true nobility of his life was not in the finished paintings, but in the relentless, uncompromising striving for the impossible. On one of the very last pages he ever wrote, deep in the middle of solving a highly complex geometric theorem involving the calculation of area, the equations abruptly stop. He wrote a single mundane sentence: "The soup is getting cold." The greatest mind of the Renaissance, grappling with eternal absolute laws of physics, was interrupted and grounded by the simple, earthly reality of a hot meal waiting downstairs with his friends. He died on May 2nd, 1519, just after his 67th birthday. He left his chaotic notebooks to Melzi and his vineyards to Salai, the little devil who was still with him after 30 years. The famous legend that he died in the very arms of King Francis I persists because it perfectly captures how deeply revered he was. Despite historical records showing the king was likely elsewhere celebrating a birth, Leonardo wasn't a genius because he possessed inaccessible magic. He was a genius because of his relentless, almost painful dedication to the act of observation. He refused to accept the boundary between art and science. The hydraulic mechanics of a bird's wing, the flow of a riverbed, and the anatomy of a smile were all just different lenses for understanding the exact same interconnected universe. But studying his life leaves us with a haunting historical question. What if Leonardo hadn't been so disorganized, possessing the administrative focus to publish his 13,000 pages during his lifetime? Would his insights have kick-started the scientific revolution a full century before Galileo and Newton? Or, in an era of the Inquisition, would publishing those radical truths have simply gotten the greatest mind in human history burned at the stake as a heretic? It is a thought that fundamentally changes how we view the timeline of human progress. If you have been inspired by this exploration into the mind of a true master, please make sure to comment your thoughts below, like, share, and subscribe to Legendary Lives Unveiled to help us bring more incredible history to life. Keep your curiosity alive. Actually observe the world around you today. And think about that the next time you look at a simple notebook.